WordPress makes creating and maintaining a website easy. That's why over 40% of websites on the internet use WordPress. It's by far the most popular content management system in the world. But the same features that make WordPress easy to maintain don't necessarily make it fast. And nowadays, no one wants to wait. If your website takes more than 3 seconds to load, people abandon ship and bounce out of your site. Fewer people will convert, and because search engines know consumers don't like to wait, they take speed into consideration for your search engine ranking. I'm going to show you how to improve the speed and performance of your WordPress website. We'll look into plugins, themes, optimizing images using CDNs, managed WordPress hosts, and the right way to test and measure the speed of your website on a weekly basis. I'm Patrick Rowland, and I've been building WordPress websites professionally for over a decade. I've built sites for clients, created custom themes, developed plugins, designed software, and worked with WordPress hosts. If you're ready to take your WordPress site to the next level, then come join me in my LinkedIn Learning course. Before we dive in, let's go over what you should know. First, you should be very comfortable with WordPress. That means knowing how to find and install plugins, how to select and customize themes, and how to use the WordPress admin interface. Next, it'll be helpful if you're familiar with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. A lot of the optimization in this course focuses on these front-end technologies. Next, you'll need to know a little bit about how WordPress hosting works. You won't need to know the details about server optimization, but some basics about how servers work will help with a lot of the back-end optimization. And finally, you should be open to exploring. Some of the things I will show you will not work on your site, and some of them will work better than the example on screen. So come prepared with an open mind, knowing that your results will vary. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of speeding up your website, it's important to understand why speed is important in the first place. The one-sentence summary is, no one wants to wait. The less time people have to wait, the more time they have to browse your site and convert, whether that means filling out a lead generation form or checking out on your e-commerce store. Numerous studies show that as page speed goes up, so does the bounce rate. People either leave before your page finishes loading, or they're so frustrated they don't take any action when it does load. Whatever the reason, a high bounce rate is bad news. Similarly, the slower the website, the fewer pages visitors read. If things are snappy, someone might read 9 pages. But if pages take forever to load, the same person might only read 3 pages. People just don't want to wait. The bounce rate and number of pages are only 2 elements affected by your website speed. Numerous case studies show that A/B testing to optimize a website speed almost always corresponds with an increased sales and revenue. In this case, the sped-up version of a website increased the company's orders by a massive 16.5%. When you're working on optimization and your goal is to increase conversions, here's a rule of thumb. A 1-second delay decreases conversions by 7%. If your site loads in 4 seconds and you can reduce it to 3 seconds, you could see a 7% increase in conversions. The other big reason to increase your website speed is to improve your search engine optimization, or SEO. Search engines know that people don't want to wait, so they rank fast websites more highly than slow websites. Google started using speed as a factor for PageRank way back in 2010, since their Core Web Vitals initiative began. It's only become more relevant in recent years. If you want a rule of thumb for load time, then shoot for less than 3 seconds. If your website can go faster, then go faster. It'll only help your site. But 3 seconds is a great initial goal if your load time is slower than that. These 3 benefits make speeding up a website easy to sell to your stakeholders. Number 1, the lower bounce rate. Number 2, increased conversions. And number 3, better search engine ranking. If you're a web developer, you can tell your boss exactly how a faster website will make the company more money. And if you work for a web development agency, you can offer the added value of website optimization as a service, or include it as part of your website build. Speed is incredibly important, if you actually want users to visit and interact on your website. Now let's see if we can help you find a starting point for your website. There's a great quote which applies to this whole course and especially this lesson. What gets measured gets improved. Lucky for us, website speed is easy to measure, break down, and analyze. And this is important because what works for one site might not work for another. I have seen some sites try to implement speed improvements and actually slow down because they broke some other aspect of their site. So we always want to measure and confirm that our sites are getting faster. So let's take a quick tour of the tools that we can use to measure our site speed. Google PageSpeed Insights is a great tool, and since one of our main reasons we're improving the speed of our site is to rank better, we should at least occasionally check our site against the official Google tool. One of the things I like about the Google tool is it gives you scores for desktop and mobile. It's very common to see a much lower score for mobile. Don't worry if you see that really low number because this is just a starting point. KeyCDN has a few tools and they give you a helpful list of things to improve. They also let you choose a server as the test location, so you can see how the site loads for someone who is close to your server compared against someone who lives far away. My favorite tool is GTmetrix. To give you an idea of what a full report looks like, type your website into the text field. I've already done this and loaded my personal blog. So you can scroll down and see they have their own grades. They use the same web vitals that Google uses. They also have a speed visualization tool, so you can see what a browser is rendering at each second. The Performance tab shows you the web vitals, and if you want to learn more about them, you can click on the helpful links. The Structure tab will list suggestions ordered by how big of an impact they'll make. As you can see here, this site is pretty well optimized already. The Waterfall tab is perhaps my favorite part. It shows you how each element in an HTML page loads. We'll talk about this waterfall in future videos, but if you see a large item, it could be blocking all of the items behind it. So one of the things we'll do in this course is find large blockers and either reduce their size, remove them entirely, or lazy load them at the end. We actually haven't seen the killer feature in GTmetrix, and it's so simple. With a free account, we can monitor your website and get a daily, weekly, or monthly email summarizing their page speeds. And the reason this is super important is that WordPress websites are always changing. The typical site owner is constantly adding and removing plugins, changing the theme's look and feel, and uploading images. Numerous times in the last year, I've received an email from GTmetrix and noticed that my score dropped, which likely means some plugin, theme, or setting I changed in the last week is the culprit. So make sure to click Monitor and set up a recurring email. Throughout this course, we're going to optimize this test site. This is a copy of my real, live, laid-back games website that sells this actual physical product. I've already optimized the live site, so I recreated it for this course so we can optimize it together. I'll copy the URL here. Let's go to GTmetrix, and we can paste it in, and click Analyze. We're going to use this report as a baseline throughout the course. I strongly recommend that you pause this video right now to take a speed test yourself for your own website. This way, you'll have a concrete starting point. As you can see, with this site, we're doing okay, but we can do much better. Some of these numbers, like first contentful paint, looks okay, but the fully loaded time of 5 seconds looks a little rough. Now let's start diagnosing what can actually go wrong with a site. Before we get into more tactical techniques to speed up your site, let's focus on the process of building and rendering a web page, because each part can be done quick and easy or slow and hard. When someone visits your website, their browser requests a web page from a server first. In our example, if someone wants to visit Laidback Games, they'll request a web page from the server. Then the server uses WordPress to assemble the page. It turns a bunch of PHP files into a single HTML file which is returned to the visitor's browser. The time this process takes is called the time to first byte, or TTFB. This isn't one of the official Lighthouse performance metrics search engines like Google use, but it is still very helpful to know. A good goal for time to first byte is less than 200 milliseconds. If it's higher than that, it's very likely a server or WordPress issue. If the time to first byte is lower than 200 milliseconds, you can focus on optimizing the front end of your site. To decrease the time to first byte and increase your website speed, start by optimizing the server's location. If most of your customers are in a specific geographic region, try to put a server close to them. You can also lower the TTFB by changing how the server assembles the HTML file. In this course, we'll look at how to do that with WordPress. A slower TTFB could be due to how fast your server parses PHP, how many plugins you have, what your plugins are doing, what theme you use, how many templates you have, and how many template parts WordPress has to stitch together. Once the visitor's browser has the HTML page, it reads the HTML and loads assets, including images, CSS, and JavaScript files. We've all heard about HTTP. That's the protocol your browser uses to download files, and for decades, we've primarily used HTTP 1.1. HTTP 2 is a new protocol, and if your server and the client's browser both support it, then you can download assets in a new fashion called multiplexing. With HTTP 1, you download one file at a time. With HTTP 2 and multiplexing, you can download multiple files at the same time. This sounds like a minor feature, but it's actually huge. Imagine needing to send separate emails for each part of a birthday party invite, one for the image, one for the music, and one for the text. And you can only send the second email after you've received a response to the first. With HTTP 2, your browser sends the equivalent of one request, or based on our analogy, one email, for everything: image, music, and copy. The server can respond to your request with all the files it has available, and you will get your assets much faster. If you have a huge file, for instance, a large uncropped photograph, the other files won't get stuck behind it, slowing down the load time for the rest of the website. Once the browser has a few assets, it starts rendering them. The first couple colors are called the first paint. Once you start adding content, this is called the first contentful paint, or FCP, and it's one of the main signals search engines use to measure the speed of your site. Here's what Google says about first contentful paint. The FCP measures how long it takes the browser to render the first piece of DOM content after a user navigates to your page. The DOM is the Document Object Model. It's the way that the browser processes an HTML page. You don't need to know what it is, and for our purposes right now, it basically means HTML page. I like to think of FCP as content with CSS for colors and styles. You want your FCP to be 0.9 seconds or less. Users expect to start to see your website's content loading quickly. If you have a good time to first byte, and the first contentful paint takes too long, then your assets are likely the culprit. To improve your FCP, reduce the size of your assets. Start by optimizing your images, make sure your server can handle HTTP 2, and concatenate files. When you concatenate, you download one medium file instead of a dozen tiny files. We'll be covering all of these techniques later in the course. After first contentful paint, your browser continues loading and rendering images, new style sheets, and JavaScript files. Then it gets to the largest piece of content, which is usually an image or video. This is called the largest contentful paint, or LCP. You want your LCP to happen in 1.2 seconds or less. The LCP should load quickly because Google assumes it's important, and they want the largest and most likely important content to load quickly. With WordPress, there are ways to make sure that the LCP loads early. Just make sure that your time to first byte and first contentful paint are already hitting their targets. After the largest contentful paint, your browser keeps adding the remaining assets until the page is fully loaded. The time it takes to get the whole page loaded isn't a major indicator for search engines anymore, but that doesn't mean your users won't get frustrated. As a goal, your website should load completely within 3 seconds. As you can see, there are a lot of ways to slow down your website with inefficient loading processes. As we go through this course and start improving the major metrics like time to first byte, first contentful paint, and largest contentful paint, remember that there are loads more. About half of these metrics are going to encourage you to return that first byte faster, or to load an important piece of content faster. And the other half of these metrics are going to be about loading fewer assets and loading them quicker. We're going to use a combination of techniques to improve all of these metrics. Before we start trying to optimize our site, let's cover one final concept, and that is the drastic differences between static and dynamic websites. A static website has content that rarely changes. Think about a simple brochure website with a home page, an about page, a services page, and a contact page. Information sites can also be static, even incredibly large ones like news sites. A dynamic website has content that changes often. Some dynamic websites even look different to every single user. Think about e-commerce websites where each visitor has their own cart, or membership sites where users see different content based on their membership level, or even based on what content they've already consumed. Many techniques we'll cover in this course will work for both types of websites. But there is one particular technique that works very well with static websites and doesn't work well for dynamic websites, and that is caching. There are many different types of caching, and we're going to cover them later in this course. But let's look at one type of caching to highlight how it works and why it works better for some websites than others. With server caching, the web server processes a page, assembles all the different pieces, and saves the HTML output. Then the next person who visits that page gets the saved copy, which saves a ton of processing time. Caching can be an incredibly powerful tool for static websites. The very first user to visit a blog post will trigger the server to assemble that web page. The server caches it and returns it to the user. Every future visit uses the cached version of that blog post, which saves your server so much processing time, and it saves your users loading time. But it's a lot more limited for dynamic websites because you can't cache the whole page. Be aware of what kind of website you have. If you try to use techniques that speed up a static brochure website, you'll be disappointed when they don't work as well on dynamic e-commerce websites, or possibly even slow down a dynamic e-commerce website. For this course, we're going to focus on speeding up a dynamic website. As you're following along, you can optimize any type of site. Just keep in mind that certain techniques will be more or less effective depending on the type of site that you're optimizing. When people talk about optimization, they usually focus on the front end. That means digging into the HTML code, combining CSS files, deferring JavaScript files, and optimizing images. These are all very useful techniques, but they're also the easiest techniques to implement, and they only affect your speed after the visitor's browser receives that initial HTML page. It's important to remember that web hosting directly affects your initial page load, and it's worth investigating even if switching hosts could be time-consuming or expensive. I just performed a speed test on my personal blog, and I'm using my blog instead of the laid-back game site to show you a simpler static site for this example. If we take a look at the homepage, we can see that the page loaded in 1.5 seconds, which is a very good time. Keep in mind, the rule of thumb is 3 seconds or less. So what part of this overall speed test is controlled by your hosting, or is mostly affected by hosting? For a WordPress website, a user visits the page, your server processes all the PHP files, creates the HTML page, and then returns it to the user. Your hosting settings directly affect this part. If you have more RAM, faster CPU, or more PHP workers, your server can stitch these PHP files together faster and return them to the user faster. So if you have a slow time to first byte, that's this number right here, that could be affected by your hosting. It could be very low CPU, or it could be only one PHP worker, but there are other factors. The time to first byte is also affected by your theme, plugins, and settings, in addition to the raw hosting power. If you have a horribly slow plugin, your time to first byte could be 5 seconds, even on the best hosting on the planet. Luckily, there is a trick you can do to test just the hosting aspect of your site. Instead of testing an actual page on your site, which is affected by plugins, settings, and themes, Test the already generated HTML README file, which WordPress installs by default at yoursite.com/readme.html. You can see that page right here. This will test how fast a server can receive your request, route it to the right place, and return a file. Some hosts might not install this README, or it might be blocked. If that happens, reach out to your host so they can test that README file, or create a simple HTML file yourself and upload it. I've gone ahead and I've speed tested this HTML README file. You can see that loading the README file takes a total of 519 milliseconds, and the important time to first byte is 229 milliseconds, which is a pretty good time. I like to think of this number, this 229 milliseconds, as the baseline number. This is an already assembled HTML file that your web server is just sending to a user. And if you use caching, which we'll talk about later in this series, this is the absolute fastest your web server could deliver a cached page to a user. This trick helps you see how fast your web server can return a file, but there is still processing time that you have to consider for dynamic content. This is where you can compare these speed tests. With our homepage, we can see that the time to first byte is 344 milliseconds, and the README is 229. The difference between these two numbers is how much time our server spends processing and putting all the PHP files together. For my site, it takes the server an extra 115 milliseconds of processing time to assemble the homepage over a static README file. This is a very good time. If you have a lot of plugins, or a complex theme, or a slow server, this could take a lot longer. And if you're unhappy with this number, the rest of the series will improve other aspects of your site, but we can't improve this number. That's why we're starting here. If it takes your server 300, 400, or 500 milliseconds just to process a blog post homepage, you should probably look into getting better or closer hosting. And when it comes to hosting, you generally get what you pay for. If you want to get $5 a month hosting, it's probably not going to be very speedy. There's a lot of information you could consider for your website host. Rather than spending hours or days researching how fast each host will likely work for your particular website, you might want to try free trials to see which host actually works best for your particular site. One of the best ways to improve your website's hosting performance is to run the latest version of PHP, which is 7.0 or higher. There's a lot of data about this, and if you compare the old version of PHP, PHP 5.6, to the newest version, PHP 7, that PHP 7 works about 1.8 times faster than PHP 5.6. And there are some tests with specific applications, in this case, Drupal, WordPress, and PHPBB, and we can see that with WordPress specifically, it's over 2 times as fast. So how do you know if you're running PHP 7? We can go to our site, and then we can scroll down to Tools, Site Health, click on Info, and then scroll down to Server. And under Server, we can see PHP version, in my case 7.4, which is the latest. Now, if you don't see this for some reason, you can also find it in your hosting panel. So I'm going to go over to my hosting panel, and in my case, I'm using Nexus, which is a managed WordPress host. Your host will likely look a little bit different, but there should be some similarities here. I'll scroll down to Environment, and over here I can see version 7.4. And then they'll usually give you an option to upgrade to the latest version. When you do this, please make sure you make a backup. I ran this upgrade a few weeks ago, and there were some minor problems upgrading between 7.3 and 7.4. So always make sure you have a backup before upgrading. Once you're on a version of PHP 7.0 or higher, you should be processing PHP files much faster. Go ahead and take a speed test, and you should see an improvement. The internet feels like a place where your location doesn't matter. We're used to seeing content and interacting with people from around the world. Wherever you are online, every site is one click away. But you might be surprised to learn that your web server's location does matter. I live in Denver, Colorado, so I can access a web server in the United States much faster than a server in Europe, South America, or Asia. Let's play a game called Speed Tests Around the World. Now, my web server is in Michigan, which is the central part of the United States, and we're going to run a speed test to see how fast my site loads from different locations. I'll be using the KeyCDN speed test, since they make it really easy to test different locations. So I'll copy my URL here, drop it into KeyCDN, and let's start with New York, since that's probably the closest. We'll click Test, and we get 1.37 seconds. Let's give a go with London. That grows all the way to 2.1 seconds. Let's try something around the world, so we'll try Bangalore, which is 3 seconds. It's not as bad as I thought it would be. And lastly, let's try Tokyo. And we get just under 3 seconds. So the lowest time was New York at 1.37 seconds, and the highest was Tokyo at 2.9 seconds. That is more than twice the time. So when someone is close to my web server, New York to Michigan, it's only 1.37 seconds. London, which is a half continent away, is 2.1 seconds, and all the way around the world is almost 3 seconds. So what have we learned here? You want to make sure that your web server is located in the same continent to your audience, or at least the largest chunk of your audience. You probably don't know this, but board games are very popular in the United States or in Europe, so I definitely want to have my board game website in one of those two places. If you don't know where your server is located, you can find out with one of two methods. Number one is to contact your web host. This is probably the easiest method. I did it just before this video, and it took about 4 minutes. The other way is to use online tools. You can use an online website like this one. They use a technology called traceroute and plot the locations onto a map for you. And you're looking for the final location on this map. Since my website caters to a US audience, I'm very happy with where my server lives. But if you want to move your server, ask your host if they have a location closer to your customers. It's much easier to move between data centers than to set up a brand new hosting account.